Thank you very much. Thank you for attending this event here. I am Antonio Sampaio. I'm a research associate for conflict, security, and development here at the IISS. We have a lot to unpack today, so I'll go straight to the point. It is no understatement to say that we have witnessed in recent weeks a historic low point in the very long decline of the left-wing movement created by the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela just over 2 decades ago. And Tuesday, in particular, as I was sitting in an airport in Heathrow, for a moment it seemed that it would be a breaking point for Chavez's successor, Nicolás Maduro. The National Assembly leader, Juan Guaidó, recognized by over 50 countries as interim president, led a small but not insignificant number of armed forces personnel in a march. A long-standing political prisoner, Leopoldo Lopez, was released from jail. And at the end of the day, even though Maduro was still in power, there was a letter from the then head of the National Intelligence Service renouncing the government in Caracas. And this, of course, comes after days of power outages in March, years of mounting economic crisis and humanitarian crisis, hyperinflation, recession, and what is probably Latin America's largest refugee crisis in history. So fortunately, we have a very good panel here today to break this down for us. So Ivan Briscoe is the director for the Latin America and Caribbean program at the International Crisis Group based in Bogotá. Marian Jimenez Morales is a lecturer in politics at the University of Oxford's Lincoln College. And Diego Moya Ocampos is the principal political risk analyst for Latin America at IHS Markit. So, if I could start with you, Ivan. I was watching on CNN earlier today an interview by Guaido's Washington representative, Carlos Vecchio, stating that the entire inner circle of Maduro has been negotiating an exit to the government, claiming that support within Maduro is collapsing. So if you could give us the general state of play of how the political crisis is playing out inside Venezuela, and particularly inside the Nicolás Maduro government.
Yes. Maduro is an inept and authoritarian president. Guaido is acting at the very limits and probably beyond the bounds of the Constitution. And the international community in the US, in Latin America, and Russia is not assisting in any solution to this conflict, but in fact, all of them are making the situation worse. And these conditions, and particularly, I have to say, the ineptitude, the economic ineptitude of the government in recent years, have given rise to the current situation, which since the self-proclamation of Guaido as president in January has created a division so great that the very basics of a political language, who is president, who runs the country, what and what is not a coup, is contested. These are effectively contested concepts. And therefore we're left with a situation whereby on Tuesday we had something which to a degree looked like it had the setting and dynamics to a degree of a traditional coup in a Latin American context, a dawn declaration, military movements, extreme agitation within government ranks. But of course, it was supported across Latin America by countries who recognized Juan Guaido and called on the military to uphold the constitutional order in which Guaido was the interim president. These same Latin American governments, which adhere to the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which was designed to prevent coups in the first place. We are almost beyond all sense of an agreed sense of terms and definitions as to what is happening in Venezuela. So in light of that, it's extremely difficult to speak about the country, describe it, and analyze it. And that is why I will simply talk about government and opposition without making any value judgments about either side or talking about who is entitled to what, and I hope you will bear with me in that respect. Guaido's assertion to the presidency in January was born out of a sense of desperation as the moribund state of the opposition, the appalling economic crisis in the country, the scale of migration of people leaving the country, and the impatience, particularly of Latin American countries, having to deal with these flows of people. They took advantage in this declaration of the contested nature of the May 2018 elections. Now, I want to make something quite clear. There was no ballot stuffing nor fraud in the sense of ballot rigging in those elections, and this is confirmed by the opposition authorities in the National Electoral Council, who will make that case explicitly. But the conditions under which the elections were held were obviously tilted towards the government massively, including the disqualification of leading opposition candidates and parties. Now, internationally, this campaign by Guaido has been enormously successful. Recognition by most Latin American countries, most European countries, the United States and Canada, a huge United States support from the United States, which has enabled Guaido to act relatively unimpeded within Venezuela because of fears of the consequences until recently of arresting him. But domestically, Guaido's campaign has not enjoyed the same success, and this is very important. Yes, he has rapidly become very popular. People are extremely discontented, poor, malnourished, and desperate. He has got something like 60% support. His mobilization within Venezuela has been very successful. But there has been no split in the military high command, and this is absolutely vital. And I will continue to emphasize this point because I think this is the crucial lesson we must learn from the most recent uprising. Unless the situation changes in the next few days, the opposition will have to start to realize that the expected split in military high command, which was in many ways the essential precondition for its campaign to dislodge Maduro, has not been met. This is not to say there is no discontent in the lower ranks. After the attempt to bring in humanitarian aid through Colombia at the end of February, there were 1,200 deserters from the military and police who had to face rather precarious conditions on the Colombian side, it must be said. There were also defectors on Tuesday, including the head of the secret police, the Sabin. But at the same time, we're not seeing those major regional commanders, divisional commanders, break in rank. There has been a failure to secure the entry of humanitarian aid at the end of February, which obviously led to the closure of the borders with Colombia and the closure of the borders with Brazil. And there were protests and extreme discontent over the massive power cuts which occurred throughout March. But they are not led to a generalized breakdown in public order. And it was for this reason that until Tuesday, the government was actually feeling that it had enjoyed a rather successful string of political victories and will probably feel the same now, having resisted the effort on Tuesday. But it's just much more complicated than this. Chavismo is a movement, and we have to understand it's a political movement. And my interviews with people across Chavismo, from the highest officials, very high up in the chain, I can't say exactly who, but right down to the lowest levels of political mobilization, the base, those people who distribute the food rations within their neighborhoods, those people who fight on behalf of the housing projects where people have been living for the last few years, they show enormous discontent with President Maduro, with the actions of the secret police forces, with the attempt to manipulate everything for electoral or political gain, with the lack of food, with the appalling state of the health service. But they fear what one former leading Chavista called the political annihilation of Chavismo. And they see the US backing for Guaido's campaign and the fact that Guaido does come from the most radical part of the opposition, Voluntad Popular, as symbolic of the fact that they wish not only to remove Chavismo from power, but to eradicate it from the political scene in Venezuela. At the highest levels of Chavismo, you see quite a few voices of those willing to negotiate. But I think one of the greatest constituencies is those who wish to negotiate, but not now, not while the conditions are not right, not while they see the conditions to their advantage. I don't want to make any comment on whether this is appropriate or right or ethical or not, but that's the situation as it now stands. None of this is to deny that the Maduro government is not corrupt, inept, and unauthoritarian. In fact, most Chavistas would agree with all those statements. But they do not feel that they can switch to Guaido and maintain either their dignity or the government's desire to represent their interests. Nor can we deny that the Maduro government is allied to militia groups and that has little sensitivity to plural democracy and civilian rights. But for the supporters down below, it is a question of inclusion or exclusion politically. And the current formula being offered by Guaido to the Chavista ranks has not been sufficient to convince them in that respect. So I want to say that where we now stand, we can now put it pretty much in 4 key political facts on the ground, which will help to determine what will occur in the next few weeks and months of the year. Number 1, the government, President Maduro, and the armed forces control most of Venezuelan territory, with the exclusion of those pockets where it has basically handed out control to other militia or Colombian guerrilla groups, namely peripheral territories. But the vast majority of Venezuela, its urban zones, are in control of government forces. Number 2, the status quo is fundamentally unsustainable, and the Chavistas, who are thinking and intelligent and know what is happening, are perfectly aware of this. Why? Because of the effect of recent US sanctions on top of an already decayed and distressed economy, which will, over time, lead to bouts of public disorder and discontent. Perhaps the biggest we've seen so far was the breakdown in public order in the city of Maracaibo during the power cuts, when 500 businesses were looted. But we're seeing migration flows continuing. Actually, we don't know how large they are, because the borders are closed and people are crossing on informal crossings, which is an undesirable side effect of the rather hasty decision to try and bring humanitarian aid into the country in February. And there's a very present risk of worsening violence across the country. Not so much criminal violence, the effects of colectivos, and of course the risk of border spasms, of border tensions, the presence of guerrillas, and of course the bogey, as it were, the bogeyman, which is the possibility of foreign military intervention. Number 3, I would say that the government in its effort to survive, which is its primary political goal and priority at the moment, and what it devotes all its energy to, which is day-to-day survival and nothing more, has lost its international standing. It is now it is not present at the Organization of American States because Guaido's ambassador has taken the seat of the Venezuelan. The Venezuelan government, the Maduro's representative. It is not recognized across Latin America. There is talk of the IMF recognizing Guaido instead of Maduro. Even talk amongst certain opposition ranks that if Guaido can claim some Venezuelan territory, then he would also be able to claim credit from the IMF, financial credit. And within domestically, although Maduro controls territory in the narrow sense of exerting security control, he's also losing control over the social programs which have been essential to his political capital. Why? Because he can't afford the food and the medicines to be brought in. This is gradually, bit by bit, being handed over to international humanitarian agencies, which the government has not just given permission to operate in, but has invited into the country. The Red Cross is already operating. We know of other international relief operations, probably about to do so as well. We know that 7 million people, according to the UN, and these are conservative estimates, are in need of humanitarian aid. But the government effectively is losing international standing and losing its thick political presence and power within the country. And lastly, number 4, the military, and I will emphasize this until I'm proved wrong, which reminds me of the event I was in last year when one of the panelists said that Bolsonaro would not be elected in Brazil, and if he was, he would have to go into exile. And I will probably have to go into exile if I get this wrong as well. The military will not split. There will not be a coup. The military will possibly act in a collegiate, collective fashion to change the president if it believes the interests of the country are best served by that. Or, as an expert very close to senior Chavistas said, if they believe that the cost of resisting external pressure is lower than the cost of maintaining internal public order, the military will probably decide to act politically. But it will not act separately. There will not be commanders going here, there, and everywhere. It will act collectively. The knowledge within the Venezuelan military is that no coup, and there have been several, no coup has worked, has been successful in Venezuela since that of 1958, which is a long time. So this expectation of a split in the military, which is so important to Guaido's credo, needs to be revised. There needs to be a reconsideration. And the problem is the military, although I think is probably inclined to consider removing or dislodging Maduro and starting a transition with negotiations, would not be willing to do so if it seems to be acting under US pressure. And this remains one of the key problems.
Diego, Ivan mentioned the ineptitude of the Maduro government in terms of the economy, but it has been very apt or very successful to some extent in leveraging the few economic sectors that it has, such as oil, to keep stability and to keep its political allies in check. So can you run us a little bit on the role of the economy and the military and how Maduro is keeping the military on its side?
It's a pleasure to share again panel with Ivan and with Marian. Venezuela is a story of lost opportunities. A country with the largest proven oil reserves, but one where oil production is not only systematically declining, but one which is going through the most severe, unprecedented Latin American humanitarian crisis. And in this humanitarian crisis, the military has played a key role, not only because they run the oil sector, which is the country's main source of revenue, representing 25% of GDP, 50% of fiscal revenues, and 97% of foreign exchange, but also because they have directly profiteered from the humanitarian crisis by introducing a complex patronage system where they basically import everything from food to medicines which come through the country. So certainly it has become quite profitable for Maduro's inner circle elite and for the military, but not necessarily for the rest of the population. So what started as an economic, political, and economic crisis in Venezuela has turned into a full-blown humanitarian and migration crisis. Nearly 3.4 million people, according to the UN, have left the country. This is more than 10% of the population. And when I talk about the humanitarian crisis, what I mean is severe shortages of food and basic goods, including medicines, killing on a daily basis children, elderly, and vulnerable people. What I mean when I say a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, what I mean is thousands of malnourished Venezuelans queuing every day to access food and medicines. A total and absolute collapse of the health system, a whole dismantling of the vaccination programs in the country, and diseases spreading all around. Situation which has become more grave since March because of a total collapse of the electricity grid and electricity supplies. And this humanitarian crisis is spreading towards neighboring countries, Colombia and Brazil. We don't think this is going to get better. Actually, it's going to get much, much worse. The economy, Antonio, is likely to contract at least 27%. Inflation is likely already the highest in the world. It's going to go beyond 3 million%. So money, the local currency, basically doesn't mean anything. If you don't have access in Venezuela to cash, US dollars, simply you won't be able to survive. And the oil sector, which is currently being run by the military, by an active general, General Quevedo of the army, which all the upper management of national oil company PDVSA is basically militarized, is likely to continue deteriorating. Oil production, which when Chavez came to power stood at 3.4 million barrels per day, is currently at below 500,000 barrels per day. In mid-2015, just to give you a reference, it was at 2.4 million barrels per day. Some of the more dire expectations were that oil production would fall below this year to below 900,000 barrels per day. But because of the collapse of the electricity grid, at the moment, we are at production levels of around 500,000 barrels per day, and this is certainly not going to improve in the midterm. To put you things in context, for Venezuelan oil production to again reach 1.5 million barrels per day, this is mid-2015 levels, a new government, a new pro-business government attracting foreign investment would need at least between 2 and 3 years. And to get back production to pre-Chavez levels of 3.4 million barrels per day, you would need at least a decade. So this is one of the true legacies of the military and indeed of Chavez and afterwards of Maduro. Oil production, again, is likely to continue declining, and the government has also been depleting at a very fast rate the gold reserves, which currently stand at 8.5 billion, but which the government, in desperate access to cash, has been depleting. By the end of the year, there would be no gold reserves in the central bank, and gold reserves represent 2/3 of foreign reserves in Venezuela. The impact of US sanctions have not been yet felt. This is likely to start being felt in May and after July. And we have to clarify here that the reason why Venezuela's economy is in such dire strait, the reason of this humanitarian crisis is the result of epic mismanagement, first by Chavez, then by Maduro, and widespread corruption, first by Chavez and now by Maduro, and in which the military had played a key role. The head of the opposition-controlled National Assembly, Juan Guaidó, has been recognized by the US, Canada, and most EU and Latin American countries as interim president, but in practice, Maduro, I agree with Ivan, does control all government institutions in the country. The electoral authority, the Supreme Court, and crucially, indeed, the armed forces, and of course, the high military command. Juan Guaidó is the constitutional president of Venezuela. He was forced to assume the post as a result of Article 233, following very strong allegations of an electoral fraud in May 2018. Probably he was not even elected in 2013, as Chavez probably was not even elected in 2012. We have had systematic electoral frauds in Venezuela in terms of conditions and in terms of results of votes. Pro-business Guaidó has managed to unify the different opposition factions, and his main objective is to secure free and fair elections in Venezuela. It is possible that if he managed to secure free and fair elections, he's not even likely to be the potential candidate, which opposition circles claim it could be Leopoldo Lopez. So certainly his intentions are legitimate, and certainly it appears well-intentioned. In any case, I think there's no doubt, at least, that he is indeed the constitutional president of Venezuela, and that Maduro is de facto exercising control of all government institutions in the country. At the moment, Guaidó is leading strong anti-government protests and calling for the military to unify behind his leadership, and for consecutive strikes staged by civil servants to force Maduro out of power. But evidence of previous years shows that he will need much more than this to really secure regime change in Venezuela. He needs internal support from the military, which I agree with Ivan, he has yet not fully reached. We could say that the high military command still is fully aligned behind Maduro, and we will explain briefly why. And certainly, Guaidó will need a more active role of the international community than diplomatic statements that we've seen before. And the high military command in Venezuela, which is strongly aligned with Maduro, is crucial, and are in reality the key players behind the scene in maintaining Maduro in power. The equation in Venezuela is very simple, but in practice very complicated. If the military withdraws from Maduro, regime change can happen in Venezuela. If the military supports Maduro, Maduro will stay in power in Venezuela, and I agree that a split is highly unlikely. Naturally, the aim of Guaidó and of the international community is through sanctions to try to force Maduro to step down and kickstart a transition towards democracy in Venezuela. In Venezuela, there's no rule of law. There's no democracy. There's certainly no doubt about that. But this plan is certainly not working. Sanctions on its own are not enough to secure regime change in Venezuela, and this is not going to change in the next days, no matter how much protests do escalate. So which is the problem with the military? Well, the problem seems to be that Maduro has granted full control of the military over the whole economy. They control all services, they control airports, ports, they control food imports, basic goods, and they run the country through a complex patronage system. Some of them, not all, are highly involved in drug trafficking, fuel smuggling, and illegal mining, and the military clearly have very strong incentives to maintain Maduro in power. In practice, Maduro leads a military regime. And this military, which run the economy, fear that if there were to be regime change, they will be held accountable, not only for corruption and illicit activities, but also for gross human rights violations in containing anti-government protests, not only this wave of protests, but also in previous years. Maduro has other key allies, drug cartels, basically, which control or run through tons of cocaine through Venezuelan ports or airports, not to say that Maduro regime is a drug cartel in itself. It has become in practice a transnational criminal group, whether it's recognized or not as such by the international community. Maduro also supports and provides logistics for the ELN within Venezuelan territory. The ELN controls mining sites in the southern of Bolivar, and as confirmed by Colombian authorities, it is staging attacks from Venezuelan territory. A recent attack, or perhaps the most recent, is the one taking place on 28 April in Sabarena, Arauca in Colombia, and this is being fully confirmed by Colombian authorities. So the existence of these non-state armed groups controlling Venezuelan territory, the existence of pro-government non-state groups known as colectivos, which are fully aligned with Maduro and which confront protesters in the street, Cuban intelligence and the effective counter-intelligence military efforts of the DGCIM make it very difficult for those within the military not agreeing with Maduro to sustain a different stance than supporting Maduro in power. A dialogue is highly difficult. It takes two for tango. The opposition have been trying to dialogue with Maduro's administration in the last 3 years. In the Dominican Republic, it didn't work. Every time there has been effort to an election in Venezuela, there have been very strong effort between opposition and government to try to secure the minimum electoral conditions. This has not been able to secure, and we think that an electoral solution is highly unlikely unless Maduro steps down from power. We have some scenarios. I'm going to quickly wrap up in this, but any scenario imply the military playing a key role. We think protest is one key. I would like to go more in detail over this, but the stronger the protest, the stronger the repression, as we've seen in the past. And unless protests escalate beyond the capacity of the security apparatus to contain them, regime change is highly unlikely to take place. We think that the military will only change their stand in supporting Maduro if there is an external threat of the use of force, or should there is a collapse of the economy, something unlikely because Maduro's administration also has the capacity to secure revenue from drug trafficking and illicit market. And I'm going to leave it there to give some chance to Mariam. Hopefully we can get into more detail in the Q&A, but in securing oxygen for the economic sector for Maduro, Russia and China will also be playing a key role, and I'll leave it for the Q&A.
The Maduro regime, and before his Chavez, and I'm not even sure if regime is the right word, they have been accused for a long time, including by Human Rights Watch many years ago, of manipulating the courts, manipulating the institutions, infiltrating the institutions, politicizing them. The humanitarian crisis has been going on for a long time, and yet it seems that the situation really escalated when Guaido declared himself interim president earlier this year. So How can we define the Venezuelan government, and by that I mean the one that is currently sitting in the presidential palace in Caracas, and how can we think of the role of the opposition in trying to overthrow it?
Thanks everyone for coming, and also of course thank you, Antonio, for the possibility of sharing some thoughts on Venezuela today with you. When we planned this, I think it was in March or even earlier, I don't think that any of us thought that this would be the scenario under which we would be discussing the crisis. I share some ideas with Ivan, and the main one I think is that language matters, right? So for the next few minutes, I do want to stress that the position that I'm taking is Maduro is an illegitimate president, so he's a de facto exercising power. Juan Guaido is the legitimate president of the country, so we shouldn't be talking about the opposition, because then all the efforts of the Venezuelan people and the international community in trying to get that recognition would be meaningless. But I do want to, as a political scientist, I have to make a lot of emphasis on definitions and concepts, because I do think that they matter for our political discussion and for the understanding of what's going on. So over the next few minutes, I just very briefly want to highlight a couple of dimensions of the crisis, then go very briefly into the definition, or one part of the definition, and then I will go through some of the challenges for democratic transition and consolidation, which are two very different steps. So even though we have heard about this in the two previous presentations, I think it's very important that we always think about what the country is going on when we think about failures or success. It's very important to understand how people are suffering and what the conditions are, living conditions in Venezuela, but also of Venezuelans abroad, to understand the crisis. So Venezuela has the largest, proven largest oil reserves in the world, and between the 60s and the mid-80s, I think we saw a relatively stable political system which came into crumbling, and then that's at the end what led to Chavez's rise to power. Caracas is one of the most dangerous cities in the world. 92% of the population lives in poverty. The minimum wage per month is $6. We have massive shortages. 90% of food and medicines cannot be found. Hyperinflation, I think it's already reaching the 10 million%, according to the IMF. Economic performance, as Diego has said, has halved. Investments have fallen. The electricity sector has massively collapsed. So think about, the best indicator for me is my grandma. She lives in Maracay. She's 88. And when I don't hear from her in like 5 to 6 days, I know that she hasn't had access to the computer. So think about a country where the lights go out and you cannot, so your food gets rotten because your fridge is not working, right? So this is the type of conditions that Venezuelans are living at right now. Over 4 million people have fled. Over 400 political prisoners is probably going to go up if repression goes up over the next couple of days. There are at least 200 military political prisoners, and we have important paramilitary groups and guerrillas operating in Venezuela. And I do want to emphasize that, because what we see now is that Maduro is uncertain about the loyalty of the military, but he does know that he largely controls the militias and the paramilitary groups. So what we're seeing is some sort of fragmentation of the security apparatus, and we see how paramilitary groups are now operating much more fiercely than they used to. We have a large illicit economy, narco-trafficking, human trafficking at the border. Diego touched upon this, whether this is a military dictatorship or not. We do see that the military plays a crucial role. So even though the de facto president Maduro is a civilian, he is backed up by the military. So let's go to categorization. When we talk about Venezuela, there's so many different definitions and categories that are used, and the language varies according to news channels, to universities, to ideologies. I just want to list a couple until I give you what I think should be is an appropriate way to address it. So we have heard about participatory democracy. This is the regime's definition. Some have talked about a hybrid regime, somewhere in between democracy and authoritarianism. We have heard people talking about full dictatorship or narco-dictatorship, narco-tyranny or tyranny. a narco state, authoritarianism, either electoral or competitive, a kleptocracy, totalitarianism, or a failed state. It could be that at this point we are seeing a fusion of some of these factors, but for now I think it's appropriate to focus on this. So there was some sort of a working democracy back in the 50s, as I said, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, which then sort of like started to collapse. So these are the two major parties back then, COPEI and Acción Democrática. And then as these parties and the economy begins to crumble, we see the rise of populist Chavez, who, by the way, doesn't run on a socialist or Marxist platform back then. He's actually uses a democratic language because Venezuelans weren't used to a populist or sort of disruptive discourse. So we see a deficient democracy, he rises onto power, and then we see a transitioning regime from a weak democracy over to a hybrid regime. So it sort of combines the dimensions of democratic institutions like electoral authorities, parliaments, judiciaries, but these institutions do not act democratically but turn into authoritarian vehicles. So we then, from a weak democracy, move to an electoral authoritarian regime to a closed dictatorship as of today. And this is how it looks like in numbers. So Diego and both Ivan have mentioned this. So EMB autonomy in blue means electoral management body autonomy. So we see it collapses. We see how censorship effort also increased over time. We see how the Supreme Court in green also loses its independence, and we see how the parliament in violet also loses its independence over time. So this is an indicator from Varieties of Democracy, which shows precisely that decay and that transitioning regime from a weak democracy to an authoritarian regime. So just a couple of thoughts and questions, really, because this is transitions to democracies are very uncertain times. Is it irreversible? I do think that it's irreversible because it's a democratic and social collapse and also political collapse. And as I said earlier, transitions are very different from democratic consolidation. So what we're looking forward to in Venezuela is to initiate a transition process that eventually, if everything goes accordingly, goes into the consolidation step. So we do need a lot of reforms on all levels. And the core question here is which institutions matter the most for transition and which are the ones that matter for a consolidation of democracy. So this will also depend on, I think, what kind of social scientist or maybe an economist you talk to. Maybe Diego would think that the economy is the primary thing. There is maybe an in-between truth, and maybe all disciplines have to come together to look for an exit to this crisis. So it's not just about restoring private economic rights, but it's also about restoring political institutions and restoring trusts and also society as a whole. You know, many people think that Venezuelans' situation is exceptional. And it is exceptional in the sense that every country has its own dynamics, its own culture, past, etc. But there are lessons from other countries, I think, that we can look at. And there are lessons that show that the sort of problems that come together in Venezuela we have seen them in other countries before or currently. So we have massive human rights violations and crimes against humanities. We see that we need economic reforms because of the collapse. We have serious security issues, and because of the illicit economy, state institutions have collapsed, and the bureaucracy as such has also collapsed. When I was doing some field work in Venezuela in 2016-15, I was also given a talk at the National Assembly, and it's important to highlight that these people, the people in the bureaucracy they have been intimidated for years. A, B, they weren't used to working full day hours, right? So they came in for 2 hours and left. So it's a whole new culture that we have to implement in Venezuela. Taken into consideration, though, that for almost 20 years, there was another logic in power. So, yeah, and the military and corruption. So I'm not going to talk too much about the military because Diego has covered this. So I want to spend some time on the challenges for transition from a political landscape. Timing and trade-offs are important. So whether the timing for the coup or not coup, what we saw 2 days ago, was right or not, history will have to judge this. But I think right now it's very important to have a sense of time. And by that I mean that every day more than 8,000 people are crossing on the Colombian border to get either food, medicine, or to go over down south. So this situation cannot be going on much longer. But then again, I do think that trade-offs are important, and I do agree with Ivan that some sort of negotiations, whether they're public or not, need to be happening. And not only between what Ivan calls the opposition, or what I would call democratic forces in Venezuela, but also within Juan Guaido's camp and within Maduro's camp, because these aren't homogenous blocks, and I think that we have to keep that in mind. So the question is there an agreement of political elites about democratic transition? Are all on the same boat? Are all rowing in the same direction? That's something that I would like to ask. And the other question is, do the incoming regime, so let's say that it's Juan Guaido for a transitional government, right? But does the incoming regime also coincide with the outgoing regime on where we're going forward to? And I think that's another crucial point, because if you want to reconstruct a country that has been divided, deliberately divided by a regime, there needs to be a common narrative, and we need to know whether a coexistence is possible on an elite level, so that we can ask the population to forgive and reconcile. So that leads me to my next point of trust and support for the reforms. I think it's very important that Juan Guaido keeps on communicating as he does, but because of the blocks on the internet and the censorship in Venezuela, I think it's even more important that the international community, but also, for example, the representatives and ambassadors of Juan Guaido internationally, keep on communicating what's going on and also what the plan is for the day after. So there needs to be support, I think, for the reforms that are coming for Plan País. We don't fully know yet what Plan País is, but the population, the Venezuelan people, should support whatever is coming. So that needs to be taken into account. And as I said, we need a grand narrative that explains what happened so that we can move forward. When we have so many divisions about what's going on in the country, I don't think that it will be feasible to move on. And I'm going to wrap up with this point: representation and inclusion. Chavez came to power because there was a disconnect between parties and the population. In general, though, it's a very different situation than today, right? So back in the days, Venezuelans could express their views freely, and they could actually vote for Chavez to see whether a radical change could be done to the political system. Today, we have a lack of representation and a lack of inclusion because of deliberate actions by a regime. Nonetheless, it's the same sort of starting point. So a transitioning government needs to include those that believed in Chavez. And I do think that there are people that still believe in this project, whether they're in Venezuela or not. For my fieldwork in Colombia just a few weeks ago, I was talking to homeless Venezuelans on the streets, and they didn't struck me as Guaido supporters. You know, they want change because they want to go back to Venezuela, but they were deeply connected to the project that gave them a house, or gave them a car, or gave them something. So that's something that a transitioning government will have to take into account, and we'll have to see whether Juan Guaido or the day after government will be a coalition government between, Chavistas or only the democratic parties, or whether we'll see free competition, so single parties running for power.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent set of presentations. So thank you very much for that. Jonathan Worthington from Ministry of Defence. Ivan, you were fairly critical of the United States.
Yes.
What exactly would you expect the United States to do here? I mean, it would require superhuman restraint, surely, for them not to be involved, particularly given the level of Russian involvement and also Chinese involvement. What can they do to help bring about a favourable outcome? And also, other panellists, who can act as an honest broker here? Who would be trusted?
Let me be clear. without US support, Guaido would not have been able to restore opposition momentum in January, to be able to move freely throughout the country, and to gain that extraordinary wave of recognitions which he did throughout Latin America and Europe. And given the state of the opposition at the end of last year, when it was effectively comatose, fragmented, and going nowhere, that is an extraordinary achievement. I mean, we were watching by the end of last year, a sort of drift into an authoritarian stasis. And that was reversed. So that's a major achievement in itself. But I will say this, the constant hectoring from John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, the gleeful restoration of the Monroe Doctrine, the denunciation of the troika of tyranny, and the promise to roll back socialism across the Americas, it not only offends parts of the Venezuelan opposition, which are actually social democrats, but causes the large parts of Chavismo to say, wait a minute, we could actually, sit down and negotiate and then find ourselves losing power and being at the end of a huge witch hunt from these forces, because the bottom line is that they are determined to enact a reversal of the ideological trends which governed Latin America 10 years ago, and of which they are the remaining representatives there. So I think what the United States has to do, well, first and foremost, I would like it to rule out the possibility of any military intervention, because at the end of the day, I don't actually see a narrative for military intervention which could work, particularly if it's a military intervention focused on defeating the Venezuelan military, which is essential to the stability of any transition, and I think everybody here would actually agree on that. You need the Venezuelan military, with all its defects and vices and criminal ties and what have you, to be there. If you don't have the Venezuelan military because it has been defeated in battle, quite what will hold Venezuela together in a transition is uncertain. I think what the United States should do is temper its rhetoric and realize that it's important to allow for back channels of negotiation to put together, to frame in private some form of possible framework for negotiation. And if the United States doesn't want to participate in it, then it at least allows elements of the opposition and possibly Guaido to go about doing that himself. Because at the moment, and this is the point which I didn't get around to making but have to make, I do not see a winner in this situation. All I see are the costs of perpetuating a sanction regime and a government desperate for political survival under the sanctions regime, which will not actually benefit anyone in Venezuela, least of all Guaido. Now, I understand entirely that they want to avoid a false dialogue, which is what Guaido's diagnosis of previous rounds of dialogue is, and there's every reason not to trust the government. But I do believe that the United States was really committed to a negotiating route, even if it doesn't say so in public. It could possibly talk with the Russians. Elliot Abrams has already been speaking to the Russians about this, not very productively, it has to be said, and to the Chinese, who are perhaps more amenable, and support informally the EU International Contact Group and other efforts of that ilk, and actually create some form of momentum in that regard. It can't put all its eggs in the baskets of constant escalation.
Thank you. Before I call upon Diego and Mariana, I'd just like to collect a few more questions just for the sake of time. I see one hand back there first, and then here. Thank you.
Thanks. Rolando Seijas from Cambridge University. I just want to ask, what do you see as a role of Cuba in a transition in Venezuela?
Thank you. And then, sir.
Member of IISS. You listed the definitions of state, and the very last was failed state, but none of you went through the problem using the parameters of failed state. Venezuela already meets the United Nations definition of a failed state by an extraordinary number of statistics, and it was only by the spillover effect in Colombia and the region of South America that we got the consensus in the Organization of Americas to formulate the support for Guaido, in addition, of course, to the U.S. support. So why is no one addressing this as a failed state that is having tremendous spillover effects on all the country that are horribly negative, and that it should be dealt with in the normal way?
Thank you. And last for this round, just in front of him.
Michael Cullen from Control Risk, based in Bogota, Colombia, but also run our operations in Venezuela. I know this question gets asked to us quite a lot, so to put you on the spot a little bit and to get your opinions, when do you predict regime change? Put your money where your mouth is, if you will. Is it going to be a long-term Castro-type situation with the complete subjugation of all the institutional powers, or do you expect change in 6 months, 1 year, 3 years? Obviously, this is an incredibly critical question to our collective clientele, because there's billions of dollars worth of investment that's sitting on the sidelines at the moment watching events, and they want first mover advantage in the Venezuelan market when it comes back online. So I'd like your predictions about when we will see regime change in Venezuela.
Thank you. Luckily for the speakers, I will instruct them to select the questions that they are more comfortable answering. So perhaps if we can start with Maria.
Who wants to predict first? I just want to very quickly go back to the US. I think what is very important is to not polarize the situation, because that doesn't help at all. And if the transition to democracy in Venezuela is dominated or polarized by a Republican government, I think that will have impacts on the consolidation, not only on the transition. So I think it's very important to get also the Democrats on this. So, for example, you know, when Ilhan Omar makes pronunciations about how this is the fault of the US, that doesn't help the Venezuelan people. And I also don't think that the rhetoric about the Monroe Doctrine is any helpful for this. So it should be a bipartisan effort. And I agree with Ivan that, or I would tend to say that the contact group, for example, it's not useful unless the US and or other players make a step in there. Because otherwise, Juan Guaido or Maduro will not have any incentives to join a negotiation effort. The predictions, I got this question asked when Juan Guaido swore in as president, and I said, shouldn't be more than a few weeks. This was in January. I do think that it needs to happen this year. It needs to happen this year because his mandate as president of the National Assembly runs out next year in January. And also because literally it's not tolerable anymore, and the sanctions will be hitting month by month even harder. The population will be starving more, and it's just not a feasible scenario. So 2019 it is, I hope. Yeah, so I'll pass on.
Good. And reminding that I remember that as early as 2013, when I think the major protest movement went to the streets for the first time against the government, people were already predicting then that you know the Chavista government would fall. Anyway, I'll pass now to Diego.
Thank you very much. In regards to the role of the U.S., I know it's very fashionable to try to simplify this as a U.S.-Venezuela thing. It's not. This is an issue of a government which behaved, or a regime which behaves as a criminal organization, which is trafficking tons of cocaine towards the US and towards the EU. And that's the situation on the ground. What I've seen is that the US is basically supporting the same stance that the rest of the Latin American countries are supporting, which is trying to create the conditions in Venezuela for a democratic transition and for free and fair elections to take place in Venezuela. In regards of the role of Cuba, unfortunately, and I'm sorry if I hurt anyone's sensibilities, but the Cubans and the Russians are behaving like the thugs in the neighborhood here. And so are the Chinese. And that's the reality on the ground. The Chinese have granted $65 billion to the Venezuelans, which are being paid in oil-backed loans, of which more than half have been paid. We started talking about a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. Starving elderly, children, vulnerable people dying on a daily basis, malnourished Venezuelans queuing to access food and medicines, a whole collapse of the health system in a country which not only had the largest proven oil reserve, but a country which was producing 3.4 million barrels per day. And the Chinese had been paid almost half of those 65 billion. These are facts. These are official statistics. So I am sorry, but the Russians, the Cubans, and the Chinese have been behaving as the thugs in the neighborhood. We're talking about military intervention. It's time to start being politically correct here. It's time to stop pretending this is not happening. The Venezuelan administration of Nicolas Maduro is behaving as a transnational criminal organization. There's no possibility of a dialogue with people who are trafficking drugs and who are highly involved in a patronage system which is killing children, elderly, and vulnerable people. And this is something which everyone's talking behind the scenes in diplomatic circles. And the other issue is we're talking about military intervention. There is already a military intervention in Venezuela, ladies and gentlemen. On 23rd of March, two Russian Air Force aircraft landed at the Simón Bolívar International Airport carrying 100 Russian soldiers and identified equipment. Have we heard about this? Everybody knows it. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, confirmed the deployment and explained this was part of Russian bilateral military cooperation with Venezuela. There is already a military intervention. There is a strong presence of the ELN, which is an insurgent group highly involved in drug trafficking and staging attacks from Venezuelan territory towards Colombia, already happening. There is already a military intervention in Venezuela. Whether we dare to recognize this or not, whether we are perceived as analysts afraid of confronting the reality that this is a drug cartel and everybody knows that, well, that's a problem, probably a debate, or whether the role of the US and Venezuela, we're going to simplify this. Well, probably that's a topic for, a Latin American society in a university. But if we're going to really touch on the sensible issues of this, we have to talk about drug trafficking, funding for drug trafficking organizations, and money laundering in large scale through the EU financial system as well. And that's a reality. And the easier and the faster we face it, the better I think the international community is likely to build up on a solution and create the capabilities for regime change and for the Venezuelans to be freely not only allowed to vote, but also to eat and access to medicines. And that's the main reality.
Thank you. Ivan, I think you will have the final word.
Thank you very much. I just want to pick up on what Diego said. I mean, I totally understand that the regime is involved in all these criminal activities, but I don't think that makes it any easier in devising a solution, because it is in power, it has established those deep networks of support and patronage across the state, and if you like, it is holding the Venezuelan people hostage. And you might say, well, we don't negotiate with kidnappers and we don't negotiate with hostage takers. But the risks of a misstep are so enormously high, I believe, that every other possibility has to be conceived. And I would also say that although there are all those elements in Chavismo, there are also decent people. And these are not necessarily the most powerful ones in Chavismo, nor do they hold the deciding influences, but they actually believe that there is a substantive political cause. And I think with these people there is a possible dialogue, and hopefully they will be able to somehow herd those spoilers and hardliners and criminals towards the right door. I just want to say very briefly, Cuba is a very difficult position at the moment, because obviously it's targeted by the recent heightening of US sanctions, and targeted by the discourse of the US officials. It doesn't feel very tempted to support any form of transition in Venezuela. Obviously, it will have to be placated at some stage if we're moving in that direction. I am not going to make a concrete prediction, because I'm just going to get it wrong, but I would say this. I think two actors are going to be very important in perhaps creating the necessary, but we're not just talking about support for a dialogue process or a negotiation process. We're also talking about giving guarantees to both sides that the promises made in both directions will be met. The Chavismo wants promises that it will not be annihilated as a political force, and of course it wants guarantees of immunity from prosecution. And the opposition wants guarantees that there will be free and fair, internationally monitored elections, and the results will be respected. Those are the core from either side. And you need a growing constituency of international actors stepping up to actually give those assurances. And I think the United States is not going to move for the moment, but I do see Colombia, because of its exposure to the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, could start to try to explore avenues of negotiation. I think China is not nearly as dogmatic as Russia in its support for the regime. I would say those 100 soldiers were primarily coming to maintain what seems to be the aerial defense system, and because there's a lot of Russian military equipment which has been bought by Venezuela.
But there are Russian troops in Venezuela, right?
Of course there are, yeah.
So
They're
there's
Russian
there's
engineers, military engineers primarily.
The
yeah.
Russian.
Yes. And I believe that the military, I think the best outcome, frankly, the best outcome, and it's not a very nice outcome, is in some respects would be a sufficient breakdown of public order and support for the government that the military as a bloc decides, look, Nicolas, it's time to move on. We've got a civilian alternative who we like, who's a bit more, a bit more friendly, a bit more attractive, and he could sit down and negotiate the terms of the transition with Guaido. And I think if that's the case, then Guaido would have to respond by saying, yes, I want guarantees A, B, C, and D. I want gestures such as the release of all political prisoners, and then start moving towards that process, because it's got to end in elections.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze in one or two final questions, but everybody will have to be very brief, please. Sure, I will press on that. No. The lady in green.
I mean, we can call it a failed state, but I don't see how that can that would actually change the diplomatic approach towards it. There are many failed states around the world. There's a failed states index which lists dozens of them. What substantive difference would it make to diplomacy? I'm not 100% sure. It would make a difference to the sort of reconstruction and transitional programs, but we're not there yet. We're not in the transition yet, and that and so I think once we are in the transition, then I think the political and economic reconstruction project should be based a little bit on that paradigm.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. I will urge everybody to be very brief because we run out of time.
I'm Vanessa Neumann. I'm Juan Guaido's official representative to the United Kingdom. So I will answer your question, sir. As I wrote in my book on the topic, blood profits, Venezuela is not a failed state. It is functioning perfectly as what it is, a giant criminal syndicate. Massively kleptocratic and corrupt governments operate that way, and if you understand it that way, you will understand some of the solution. And you will hear me, as I continue with my diplomatic mission here, you will hear me stating this over and over again. One of the things that I think is impeding a regime change and a transition to democracy, and one of the things I would like to see. By the way, I started my career working under Patrick Cronin here at the IISS, and it was after that that I worked paramilitary reintegration in Colombia. So, and that was in 2005. Given that it was the IISS that did the analysis of the Raúl Reyes laptop in 2008 after the attack on the Devia camp and the FARC in Ecuador, that was the first time we had a revelation of the involvement of Chavez as a money laundering operation for Russian organized crime tied to the Kremlin and linking to the FARC. So those relationships of illicit finance, now we're in 2019, are much deeper than what was revealed in that 2008 laptop. And to my mind, unless we understand how deep and how extensive those relationships are and the role of the Venezuelan regime in illicit finance for all manner of criminality, or Hezbollah, Russian, etc. Hezbollah told me personally, commanders of Hezbollah told me in Beirut that they were intent on propping up whoever came after Chavez because of his importance in their finance. I did not go with my American passport, as you can imagine, when I asked these questions. Okay. So given that, we need to understand, and I'm looking to institutions like the IISS, who were the pointy tip of the spear in this type of analysis, to help provide a solution for us who want democracy to find how we can cleanse the financial system so that we can the Venezuelan regime can stop functioning as a giant money laundering operation, which is basically one of the impediments to democracy.
Thank you very much. And this report to which Vanessa Newman referred to is called the FARC Files, and it has been published in English and Spanish by the IISS. I'm afraid that we really ran out of time, but if you are in around the house, the good news is that you can maybe have a chat with some of our speakers. I really appreciate the time. And I would just like to make a brief announcement that on the 15th of May, we will have the launch of our Armed Conflict Survey, the 2019 edition. This is an annual publication that tackles some of the political issues such as fragile states, failed states, and organized crime that were mentioned here in other contexts. So 15th of May. So with that, please join me in thanking our excellent speakers.